What if we said that there is something wrong about a society in which people are humiliated in order to get the necessities of life? What if we factored in, so to speak, humiliation as a cost or benefit? Then it's not efficient to allow people to be humiliated. And then we might well say, as indeed in some societies we have said, that we should provide the social services, even though they're more expensive, even if they're less efficient, because we are, in a broader sense of our calculations, acting efficiently in pursuit of our broader objectives. That is a way of saying that social democracy consists, and has to consist, in articulating what we think the good society is. We have lost the capacity not to do that, but to talk about it. Ask yourself again, what do you think of the conversation now going on around the healthcare? Or ask yourself about the infamous torture memos of the previous administration, in which highly educated, young, middle-aged men exchanged complicated, thoughtful memos on the pros and cons of torturing people. What struck me upon reading those was that never did you see the question raised as to whether this was the right or wrong thing to do. It was asked, is it efficient? Is it instrumentally functional? Does it achieve its goal? I saw one memo which even asked, in a sophisticated philosophical sort of way, whether on rural utilitarian grounds we should torture, i.e., is it wise to torture, even if it works, because we might be setting up precedents and practices that we would not, on other grounds, find very functional. But never was it asked, is this evil? Is this good? Is this right? Is it wrong? Is it just? Is it unjust? That's a vocabulary that we need to reintroduce into public discourse. We can do it by starting with the question of what kind of society we want. There are two ways to do that. One is, if you like, the normative way, to simply say, let's begin again to think what sort of purposes, what sort of narrative, if you like, within which we wish to place public policy debate, public policies, public choices. Let's learn to talk in a moral narrative and then make decisions from within it rather than from within the economic narrative that we've become accustomed to. That's hard. Social democrats used to do that, but because their narrative was inserted in a historical one, they didn't have to ask, is something right or wrong, but is it moving in the right historical direction? Is capitalism doomed, or is capitalism the future? We have to ask, because those questions don't make sense to us anymore. We have to ask what's right and what's wrong about a particular policy. To do that, we have to have a larger sense of what we mean by those words. The second option would be to return to the 18th century, which I've quoted once or twice here, and ask, what is it about commercial society, as they called it, financial capitalism, as we might call it, that is abhorrent to us? What is it that we instinctively find wrong about our public arrangements? What can we do about those within terms that make sense to us? which respond to our sense of fairness, which respond to our sense of impropriety, which respond to our sense of something that we've lost, something we know but don't articulate very well collectively, something that's wrong when we have private police forces, something that's wrong when we farm out responsibility for tax collection, something that's wrong when we farm out responsibility for the care of the aged. But there's a third way to think, and I'll close on this one. We are now entering, I believe, a new age of insecurity. The last age of insecurity was the one that Keynes brilliantly described. By age of insecurity, I mean this. The great age of what was not then called globalization, the first great age, ended in 1914. No one expected it to end. Everyone then believed in internationalization, the endless, necessary, benevolent increase in trade, in peace, in stability, in prosperity, in growth, and so forth. Keynes himself brilliantly described this, of course, in the opening paragraphs of the economic consequences of the peace, the pamphlet he wrote in 1921 about why the Versailles Treaty would not work, describing the world before 1914 as he remembered it. We, I think, are entering a similar period. We are entering an age of economic insecurity. We're entering an age of cultural insecurity. We're entering a period when people will no longer be so sure as they were from 1950 to 1980 that the world their children see will look like the world that they knew. We are going to need to rediscover somehow the ways in which an earlier generation responded to insecurity, to the dangers of insecurity, the political extremes which emerge, the difficulties that people have in believing that present arrangements are likely to endure, and the risk that they will turn to siren voices as an alternative to the insecurities of their own existence. Social democracy in Europe, the New Deal here, the Great Society here, were responses to that insecurity from a generation which experienced it. We, I think, who have not experienced it, most of us, the younger members of the audience here, cannot know what it meant to see a world collapsed, the world of liberal Europe, that collapsed into the catastrophe out of which the Hayek-Keynes debate with which I began emerged, and from which the Keynesian consensus that we grew up in was born, and which was forgotten in the reversion to a pre-Keynesian view of endless security, and therefore no need to worry about how to preserve it, of the last 30 years. If social democracy has a future, it has a future as the language of fear, if you like, not the language of endless, hopeful progress, but the language of memory. When the social democrats of the 19th century first emerged, they were talking about the future that was yet to be created, in which there would be reduced inequality, public services, a state which acted on behalf of all, in which there would be collective purposes, collective services, collective institutions, public goods. That was achieved. We are now losing it. The task of social democracy now is to remember not only what was achieved, but the consequences of a failure to achieve it. The consequences of a failure to recall what happens to a liberal society when it enters an age of uncertainty and insecurity. Social democracy, public goods, collective welfare, state provision of the services that today we inadequately provide privately. They are not a perfect answer. What we've learned from the 20th century is the perfect answers are frighteningly imperfect. But my own feeling, my own sense of social democracy as a possible language, a possible alternative, a possible way to begin to talk publicly about our collective goals is that it's all we have. We should be angrier than we are, much angrier than we are, about what we've lost rhetorically, collectively, ethically, in the 3 decades that we moved away from the astonishing achievements of the previous 100 years. There is something to return to, something worth fighting for, something worth collectively aspiring to. I would end, if I may, by quoting George Orwell on a quite different occasion. Returning from Barcelona in his classic, Homage to Catalonia, and writing, and I quote, "There was much in it." He's speaking of Barcelona, the revolution, 1937. "There was much in it that I did not understand. Some ways I did not even like it. I was not sure that it could work. I was not sure that it did work. But I recognized it immediately as a state of affairs worth fighting for." That, I believe, is true, whatever we can retrieve from the 20th century memory of social democracy. I leave you with that thought. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. There's microphones in each aisle. I would ask people to come forward. Keep your questions brief. Questions?